Elizabeth Harper was 36 years old, an age most in 1878 would call past her prime. Back in Boston, she'd made peace with spinsterhood, finding solace in her classroom and her books, Shakespeare, Homer, Austen, and her father's old Bible. Her father, a Harvard professor, had taught her that a woman's mind was as vast as any man's, but society disagreed. When her teaching position was stripped away because a woman who knew Latin and mathematics was intimidating, she felt the world closing in. Then came James Thornton's advertisement in a Boston newspaper: educated man of property seeks refined Eastern lady as wife. Thornton's letters were like a lifeline. He wrote of his thriving cattle ranch, his loneliness since his wife's death, and his admiration for a woman who could bring culture to the frontier. Elizabeth hesitated at first. She wasn't naive, but his replies were thoughtful, articulate, and seemed to crave a true companion, not just a housekeeper. After 6 months of correspondence, she sold her modest inheritance, her books, her furniture, and bought a one-way ticket west. She wasn't just chasing a husband, she was chasing a place where her mind might finally belong. Miss Harper, I presume James Thornton. Welcome to Silver Creek. You're older than I expected. I mentioned my age in my letters, Mr. Thornton. 36 this past April. Yes, of course. It's just different in person. Come, I've arranged a room at the hotel. We'll discuss matters over dinner. Elizabeth had come to Silver Creek seeking a partner who saw her worth. But in this harsh land where strength was measured by muscle and land, and women by their silence, she was about to discover that her greatest asset, her mind, would be her greatest challenge. And yet, in the shadows of this town, one man with a past as complicated as her own would see what others couldn't. This is where her story begins, and where Silver Creek will never be the same. 1. The beginning, Elizabeth Harper and the dream of a new life. Imagine standing at a crossroads, your whole life packed into a single bag, wondering if the path ahead will lead to freedom or heartbreak. In the summer of 1878, Elizabeth Harper faced that very moment. She was 36 years old, a woman whose mind burned brighter than the world around her allowed. Back in Boston, she'd been a teacher shaping young minds with the belief that knowledge was a right, not a privilege. But the world didn't see it that way. They called her too educated a spinster whose love for books, Shakespeare, Homer, mathematics made her an oddity, a threat even. When the school board dismissed her for daring to teach girls to dream beyond their kitchens, Elizabeth found herself unmoored, a scholar, in a society that had no place for her. Let me take you back to that moment in Boston, where Elizabeth's story begins. She lived in a modest apartment surrounded by shelves of books that were her refuge. Her father, a Harvard professor, had raised her to believe a woman's mind was as vast as any man's. He taught her Latin, reciting Fortis Fortuna, adiuvat, fortune favors, the brave as they pored over ancient texts. But her father was gone now, and Boston's rigid social rules left her isolated. Teaching had been her purpose, her way to honor his legacy. Losing that felt like losing herself. The school board's reasoning stung her. Excessive education intimidated young men and was deemed unsuitable for young ladies. It was a polite way of saying she didn't belong. That's when a single advertisement in a Boston newspaper changed everything. It read, "Educated man of property seeks refined Eastern lady as wife." The words were from James Thornton, a cattle rancher in Silver Creek, Montana, a frontier town thousands of miles away. His letters arrived like a lifeline, each one articulate and thoughtful. He wrote of his thriving ranch, his loneliness since his wife's passing, and his longing for a partner who could bring culture and ideas to the West. Elizabeth hesitated. She wasn't naive about the risks of becoming a mail-order bride. But Thornton's replies seemed genuine, promising a partnership of equals, a life where her mind would be valued, not diminished. After 6 months of correspondence, she made her choice. She sold her books, her furniture, every piece of her old life, and bought a one-way ticket west. Now let's pause to understand why this decision was so monumental. In 1878, the American West was a land of promise and peril, especially for women. The frontier was booming with towns like Silver Creek springing up around cattle and mining. But for every story of opportunity, there were tales of deception. Mail-order brides were common. Thousands of women answered ads like Thornton's, hoping for love or stability. Some found it. Others found hardship or worse. Historical records like those in Hearts West by Chris Entz tell of women like Mary Richardson, who left Philadelphia in 1875 for a Montana rancher only to discover he was a drunkard who'd lied about his wealth. Elizabeth knew these risks, yet she chose to bet on Thornton's words. Her mistake believing that a man's letters could reveal his heart. It's a lesson we can all relate to. How often do we trust promises that seem too good to be true, only to face a reality that tests our courage? Elizabeth's journey wasn't just about finding a husband, it was about finding a place where she could be whole. She wasn't chasing romance alone. She was chasing respect, a chance to use her intellect without apology. In Boston, her knowledge had been a burden, a reason for rejection. In Silver Creek, she hoped it would be her strength. But hope, as we all know, can be a fragile thing when it meets reality. And the reality of Silver Creek was about to challenge everything Elizabeth thought she knew. This wasn't just a physical journey across a continent. It was a leap of faith into a world where women were judged by their cooking, their beauty, or the children they bore, not their ideas. Elizabeth carried her father's Bible, her mother's cameo brooch, and a heart full of resolve, whispering Fortes Fortuna Adiuvat as she stepped into the unknown. What she didn't know was that Silver Creek held more than James Thornton's broken promises. It held a community wrestling with its own identity, a man named Caleb Stone who saw her worth when others didn't, and a battle that would test her courage in ways she never imagined. So what happens when a woman with a mind of her own arrives in a town that doesn't know what to make of her? When the dream she's crossed mountains for crumbles at her feet? That's where Elizabeth's story truly begins. In the dust of Silver Creek, where the brave don't just survive, they redefine what's possible. Let's follow her as she steps into this new world, ready to face whatever lies ahead. But first, picture this, a small weathered town under a vast Montana sky where every stranger is a story waiting to unfold. In our next chapter, Elizabeth arrives in Silver Creek only to discover that James Thornton's promises were as fleeting as the dust on the wind. Will she shrink under the weight of disappointment, or will she find a spark of something new in this unforgiving land? Stay with us to find out. 2. Arriving in Silver Creek, harsh reality. Picture yourself stepping into a new world, your heart full of hope, only to feel the ground shift beneath you. That's where we find Elizabeth Harper in the summer of 1878, standing in the dust of Silver Creek, Montana, a town as raw and unyielding as the land around it. She'd crossed a continent chasing a promise, a life where her mind would be valued, where James Thornton, the man whose letters had painted a picture of partnership, would welcome her as an equal. But promises, as Elizabeth was about to learn, can be as fleeting as the prairie wind. Silver Creek was nothing like Boston. It was a small, rugged outpost, a single street lined with weathered buildings where the air carried the scent of dust and cattle. The people here lived by the rhythm of the land, hard-working, practical, and wary of outsiders. Elizabeth, with her ink-stained hands and satchel of books, was as foreign to them as the Latin phrases she whispered to steady her nerves. Fortis, fortuna, adiuvat, fortune favors the brave, she told herself, but bravery felt fragile under the weight of curious stares. When James Thornton met her, his presence was commanding, tall, broad-shouldered, with a mustache neatly trimmed and a suit that spoke of prosperity. His letters had described a man who admired educated women, who craved a companion to bring refinement to his ranch. Elizabeth extended her hand, her voice steady, despite the flutter in her chest, expecting warmth, perhaps even the spark of connection they'd built through months of correspondence. Instead, Thornton's first words cut deep. "You're older than I expected." Her age, 36, had been no secret. She'd written it clearly in her second letter. But seeing her in person, Thornton's pale blue eyes assessed her like a horse at auction, and his dismissive tone hinted at a truth his letters had concealed. Let's pause to understand what was happening here. In 1878, the American West was a man's world where women were valued for their youth, their ability to bear children, or their skill in running a household. Thornton, like many men of his time, saw a wife as a practical asset, not a partner in thought or ambition. Elizabeth's education, her knowledge of literature, mathematics, and languages, wasn't a virtue to him. It was a liability. This wasn't unique to Silver Creek. Historical accounts like those in The Bride Ships by Joanne Power tell of women like Sarah Clayton, who arrived in Wyoming in 1876 as a mail-order bride, only to find her intended husband appalled by her ability to read law books. Sarah, like Elizabeth, faced a stark reality. The West promised opportunity, but often demanded conformity. Over dinner at Silver Creek's modest hotel, the truth unraveled further. Thornton had arranged a private table, ordering roast beef without asking Elizabeth's preference. As they ate, he spoke proudly of his 2,000-acre ranch, the finest in the territory, built from nothing through sheer will. Elizabeth, eager to connect, asked about the library he'd mentioned in his letters, imagining shelves filled with classic literature. Thornton's response was a shrug. Some business volumes, record-keeping, mostly. He said, his eyes narrowing as if her question was an affront. The library, like so much else in his letters, was a fiction allure to draw her west. Then came the heart of the matter. Thornton leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. He needed a practical woman. He said someone who understood her place, who could manage a household without questioning his decisions. Elizabeth's education, he declared, was excessive. He didn't want a debate partner or a scholar. He wanted a wife who enhanced his standing in Silver Creek's small, gossipy community, not one who challenged its norms. Men lead, women support. He explained as if to a child. That's the natural order. Elizabeth felt the world tilt. She'd sold everything, her books, her home, for this man's promises, only to find he saw her mind as a flaw, not a gift. Her voice grew cold as she responded. I believe there's been a serious misunderstanding, Mr. Thornton. He waved off her words, suggesting she had few options, a spinster with no family, no fortune, and a long, costly journey back to Boston. He expected her to bend to accept his terms out of desperation. But Elizabeth Harper wasn't built to bend. With a steadiness that belied the trembling in her hands, she rose from the table. I appreciate your candor, Mr. Thornton, she said, but I think we'd both be better served by ending this arrangement now. My self-respect, for one, is worth more than your offer of security. She walked away, feeling his gaze burn into her back, her heart pounding, but her resolve unbroken. In that moment, Elizabeth chose herself a choice that would define everything to come. Let's talk about what this means. Thornton's mistake was a common one, in his time underestimating a woman's strength, assuming she'd compromise her values for survival. But Elizabeth's refusal wasn't just personal. It was a stand against a society that demanded women dim their light to fit its mold. Her courage echoes stories like that of Sarah Clayton, who after her own rejection opened a school in Wyoming, proving her worth on her own terms. Elizabeth, too, was about to carve her own path, though she didn't yet know how. That night alone in her hotel room, Elizabeth faced a daunting reality. She had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks of lodging, not nearly enough for a return to Boston. Even if she could afford it, what awaited her there? No job, no home, no family. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: she wouldn't sacrifice who she was to satisfy Thornton's pride. As she unpacked her few possessions, her father's Shakespeare, her mother's Bible, a photograph of her parents, she felt a spark of determination. Silver Creek might not be the haven she'd imagined, but it was a place of possibility, a frontier where rules could be rewritten. This moment was Elizabeth's first test, and she passed it by choosing integrity over ease. But tests don't end with a single choice. Silver Creek was about to challenge her in ways she couldn't foresee, from the whispers of a town that didn't understand her to the unexpected kindness of strangers. Among them was a man named Caleb Stone, whose own shadowed past held secrets as complex as her own. Would this harsh land break her, or would it forge her into something stronger? Let's find out as we move to our next chapter, where Elizabeth, with no clear path forward, discovers an opportunity that could change everything. In a town where women are expected to follow, not lead, will she find a way to use her mind to make a difference? Or will Silver Creek's unforgiving reality prove too much? Stay with us as Elizabeth's journey takes an unexpected turn. 3. A new opportunity medical assistant to Dr. Grayson. Sometimes, when one dream crumbles, another takes its place, small and unassuming, but with the power to change your life. That's where Elizabeth Harper found herself in the summer of 1878, in the raw, dusty town of Silver Creek, Montana. She'd come west seeking a husband who valued her mind, only to find James Thornton's promises empty his vision of a wife stifling. With just a few dollars left and nowhere to turn, Elizabeth refused to let despair win. Instead, she began searching for a way to survive, not just financially, but as a woman who believed her intellect could still make a difference. Silver Creek wasn't a place that offered many paths for a woman like Elizabeth. Most women here were wives or mothers, their days filled with churning butter or mending clothes. A few worked in the saloon, a life Elizabeth knew wasn't hers. But even in this rugged frontier town, there were needs that didn't care about your gender or your past. One such need belonged to Dr. Samuel Grayson, the town's only physician, a kind but aging man whose failing eyesight made it hard to keep up with his work. He needed someone to read medical journals, organize patient records, and help with the endless stream of injuries and illnesses that plagued a cattle town. When the hotel's proprietress, Mrs. Wilkins, mentioned Dr. Grayson's dilemma, Elizabeth saw a glimmer of hope. Dr. Grayson welcomed Elizabeth with a warmth that stood in stark contrast to Thornton's cold dismissal. He didn't care that she was a woman or that her training was in literature, not medicine. What mattered was her quick mind, her steady hands, and her willingness to learn. He offered her a job as his assistant with room and board at his home and a modest wage. It wasn't the life Elizabeth had imagined when she left Boston, but it was a chance to use her intellect to contribute something meaningful. She accepted, determined to prove herself not just to Dr. Grayson, but to a town that watched her every move with suspicion. Let's take a moment to understand what this role meant. In 1878, medicine on the frontier was a far cry from the hospitals of Boston. Doctors like Grayson worked with limited supplies, iodine for wounds, laudanum for pain, and catgut for stitches. There were no x-rays, no antibiotics, just skill and instinct honed through years of practice. Women in medicine were rare even in the East. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to earn a medical degree in America in 1849, faced constant ridicule, and her successors were few. On the frontier, women were more likely to be midwives or nurses, roles often dismissed as women's work. For Elizabeth to step into a doctor's office, even as an assistant, was a bold move, one that challenged the norms of Silver Creek. Elizabeth's first task was simple organizing Dr. Grayson's cluttered records and reading aloud from medical journals printed in tiny type. But soon she was learning more how to clean wounds, mix tinctures, and recognize symptoms of common ailments like fever or dysentery. Her first real test came when a ranch hand named Tom Carver came to the office with a deep cut from a broken fence. Dr. Grayson was out on a house call, and Elizabeth had to act alone. With her heart pounding, she cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, and stitched it closed her hands, guided by the techniques she'd studied in Grayson's books. Tom, skeptical at first, left with a grudging respect, his wound healing cleanly in days. This small victory was a turning point, but it didn't come without whispers. Some in Silver Creek saw Elizabeth's work as unnatural, a woman meddling in a man's domain. Others wondered if her education was just a fancy facade hiding incompetence. These doubts weren't unique to Elizabeth. Historical accounts like those of Clara Barton, who nursed soldiers during the Civil War, show how women in medical roles were often dismissed as incapable even when their work saved lives. Clara, like Elizabeth, proved her worth through action, not argument, but the skepticism was a constant hurdle. What Elizabeth faced was a classic mistake of the time judging ability by appearance rather than results. The townsfolk assumed a woman couldn't handle the gritty realities of medicine, just as they'd assumed she'd accept Thornton's terms out of desperation. But Elizabeth wasn't here to conform. Each patient she helped was a chance to challenge those assumptions, to show that a woman's mind could be as precise as a surgeon's scalpel. She studied late into the night, absorbing anatomy and pharmacology, driven by a hunger to be more than an assistant, to be indispensable. This new role gave Elizabeth a purpose she hadn't felt since her teaching days in Boston. Yet it also made her an outsider in Silver Creek, a town where fitting in meant staying quiet. The whispers followed her about her excessive education, her failed engagement to Thornton, her audacity to work in a doctor's office. But Elizabeth held fast her father's words echoing in her mind. Fortes, fortuna, adjuvat. Fortune favors the brave, and she was determined to be brave. This courage was about to be tested in ways Elizabeth couldn't predict. As she settled into her work, a man named Caleb Stone would cross her path, a rancher with a shadowed past and a mind as curious as her own. His arrival would spark something new, not just in Elizabeth's heart, but in the battle for her place in Silver Creek. Would this town ever see her as more than an outsider? Or would her efforts to heal its people heal its prejudices too? Let's move to our next chapter, where Elizabeth meets Caleb Stone, a man who sees her worth when others don't. In a town quick to judge, will their connection offer her strength or draw her into new dangers? Stay with us as Elizabeth's story unfolds, revealing the unexpected allies waiting in the shadows of Silver Creek. For Caleb Stone, an unexpected ally. Sometimes the people who change your life the most are the ones you least expect. In the summer of 1878, Elizabeth Harper was finding her footing in Silver Creek, Montana, a town that viewed her with equal parts curiosity and suspicion. As Dr. Samuel Grayson's medical assistant, she was proving her worth one patient at a time, stitching wounds and studying late into the night. But she was still an outsider, a woman whose intellect set her apart in a place that valued conformity. Then came Caleb Stone, a man whose own story was as complicated as hers, and whose quiet respect would spark something new in Elizabeth's heart. Caleb Stone wasn't like the other men in Silver Creek. He owned a modest ranch north of town, a piece of land with a precious water source that made it the envy of bigger ranchers like James Thornton. But Caleb's past was a shadow that followed him everywhere. Whispers called him a former outlaw, a man who'd once ridden with the hair of gang, robbing banks and stagecoaches. He'd arrived in Silver Creek 3 years earlier, buying his ranch with cash and keeping to himself. To most, he was a mystery, dangerous to some, intriguing to others. Yet when Elizabeth met him, she saw something different. A man whose eyes held a depth of thought, whose words carried a quiet strength. Their first encounter came when Caleb needed medical attention for a wound from repairing a fence. Elizabeth, working alone in Dr. Grayson's office, tended to him with the skill she'd been honing. As she worked, Caleb surprised her with his knowledge, mentioning treatments he'd learned from a Cheyenne healer years ago. He spoke of willow bark for fever and lavender oil for breathing remedies Elizabeth had only read about in books. Their conversation didn't stop at medicine. Caleb asked about the book she loved, Shakespeare Homer, and shared that he'd read Marcus Aurelius, leaving thoughtful notes in the margins of a borrowed copy. For the first time since leaving Boston, Elizabeth felt seen not as a curiosity or a threat, but as an equal. Let's pause to understand why this connection mattered so much. In 1878, the American West was a place of rigid roles, especially for men like Caleb. Ranchers were expected to be tough, practical, focused on land and cattle, not philosophy or healing. An educated man with a criminal past was as much an anomaly as a scholarly woman like Elizabeth. Their shared love of knowledge set them apart, but it also drew them together, creating a bond rooted in mutual respect. This wasn't just a personal moment. It reflected a broader truth about frontier life, where outsiders often found common ground in their differences. Historical accounts like that of Henry Starr, a former outlaw who turned rancher in Oklahoma in the 1890s, show how men with troubled pasts could reinvent themselves, often finding allies in unexpected places, just as Caleb did with Elizabeth. Caleb's past, though, wasn't just gossip, it was a weight he carried. He told Elizabeth little at first, only hinting at a time when he'd been lost wounded near the Powder River and saved by a Cheyenne medicine man named Two Hawks. That healer not only mended Caleb's body, but taught him skills and wisdom that shaped his new life. Why had he left the Harrow gang? Elizabeth wondered, sensing there was more to his story. Caleb's answer when it came was simple but profound. He couldn't justify doing wrong just because life had wronged him. Those words struck Elizabeth, echoing her own refusal to compromise her values for James Thornton's approval. Their conversations grew over time, often sparked by Caleb's visits to the doctor's office. He'd bring medical journals he subscribed to from Chicago, or share insights from his experiments with drought-resistant cattle breeds. Elizabeth found herself looking forward to these moments, not just for the ideas they exchanged, but for the ease of their connection. Caleb didn't flinch at her intelligence. He admired it, asking questions that pushed her to think deeper. In a town quick to judge, he offered something rare: acceptance without expectation. But this budding alliance wasn't without complications. Silver Creek's gossip mill churned, linking Elizabeth and Caleb in whispers that painted her as reckless and him as dangerous. Some saw their friendship as scandalous, an unmarried woman and a former outlaw talking late into the evening about books and medicine. Others, like Thornton, saw it as a threat, especially since Caleb's land bordered his own with water rights Thornton coveted. Elizabeth felt the weight of these judgments, but she refused to let them dictate her choices. She'd learned in Boston that society's approval was a fragile thing, worth less than her own truth. Let's talk about the mistake Silver Creek was making here. The town judged Caleb by his past, and Elizabeth by her difference, assuming their stories were simple and outlaw, and a blue-stocking unfit for their world. It's a trap we all fall into, sometimes labeling people before we know them, missing the richness of their lives. Caleb and Elizabeth were proving that worth isn't defined by what others assume, but by what you do with the chances you're given. Their alliance was a quiet rebellion against those assumptions, one that would soon face greater tests. Elizabeth was beginning to see Silver Creek differently, not as a place of exile, but as a canvas where she could paint a new life. Her work with Dr. Grayson gave her purpose, and her connection with Caleb gave her hope. But hope, as she learned, could be dangerous in a town where power and pride held sway. James Thornton, nursing his wounded ego, was about to find a new ally in Victor Langston, a Chicago investor with ambitions as cold as his smile. Together, they'd set their sights on Caleb's land and Elizabeth's reputation, threatening everything she was building. So what happens when two outsiders find strength in each other, only to face a town determined to keep them in their place? Can Elizabeth and Caleb's bond withstand the storms brewing on the horizon? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Thornton's resentment and Langston's schemes take shape, pulling Elizabeth into a battle she never sought. Stay with us as Silver Creek's tensions rise, revealing the true cost of standing out. 5. Escalating conflict, the schemes of Thornton and Langston. Every small town has its tensions simmering beneath the surface, waiting for a spark to ignite them. In the summer of 1878, Silver Creek, Montana was no exception. Elizabeth Harper was carving out a new life as Dr. Samuel Grayson's medical assistant, her intellect finding purpose in healing the town's wounds. Alongside her, Caleb Stone, a rancher with a shadowed past, offered a rare kind of friendship, one built on shared ideas and quiet respect. But in a place like Silver Creek, Standing out came with a price. James Thornton, the man whose broken promises had brought Elizabeth West, wasn't ready to let her or Caleb thrive. And he'd found a dangerous ally in Victor Langston, a Chicago investor whose ambitions cast a long, cold shadow. Thornton's resentment had been festering since Elizabeth rejected his proposal. Her refusal wasn't just personal. It was a public wound to his pride, a reminder that he couldn't control her as he'd expected. His letters had promised a partnership of equals, but what he truly wanted was a wife who'd stay silent, enhancing his status as Silver Creek's wealthiest rancher. Elizabeth's independence, her work with Dr. Grayson, and her growing connection with Caleb Stone were salt in that wound. Thornton's own troubles made matters worse. Rumors swirled that his ranch was in debt, hit hard by a herd lost to disease and bad investments. He needed a way to regain control, and Caleb's land with its vital water source was the key. Enter Victor Langston, a man whose polished suits and smooth words hit a ruthless drive. Langston had come to Silver Creek seeking opportunities in the booming cattle industry, where Chicago's meatpacking giants hungered for more supply. Caleb's ranch with its springs and creek was a prize that could make Langston's investment soar. But Caleb refused to sell, and Thornton's own attempts to pressure him had failed. So the two men struck a deal. Thornton would help Langston secure the land, and in return, Langston's money would save Thornton's ranch. Their plan wasn't just about land, though. Elizabeth, with her growing influence in Silver Creek, was a threat to their vision of power. They decided to undermine her using the town's gossip and a local newspaper to question her role as a medical assistant. Their campaign began subtly but grew bolder. Articles appeared in the Silver Creek Weekly Gazette, hinting at concerns about an untrained woman practicing medicine under a doctor weakened by a stroke. The words were careful, never naming Elizabeth directly, but everyone knew who they meant. Thornton spread rumors at the saloon, calling her work dangerous, her education unnatural. Langston, with his outsider's wealth, leaned on the town's leaders, suggesting that Silver Creek deserved a proper physician, one he could fund. Their goal was clear discredit. Elizabeth isolate her and pressure Caleb into selling by making life in Silver Creek untenable for both. Let's take a moment to understand the stakes here. In 1878, land disputes were the lifeblood of the American West, often turning violent. Water rights like those on Caleb's ranch were more valuable than gold in a region prone to drought. Historical records like those of the Johnson County War in Wyoming in 1892 show how wealthy ranchers used intimidation media and hired muscle to seize land from smaller owners. Thornton and Langston's tactics, gossip, newspapers, and economic pressure were straight from that playbook. Elizabeth, as a woman stepping beyond traditional roles, was an easier target. Her work challenged the idea that medicine was a man's domain, and her alliance with Caleb threatened Thornton's dominance. Their attack wasn't just about land or money, it was about control. Elizabeth felt the weight of their campaign. Patients hesitated to seek her help, and whispers followed her through town. Yet she refused to shrink. Her work with Dr. Grayson, organizing records, reading journals, treating injuries, gave her a purpose she wouldn't abandon. Caleb, too, stood firm, his quiet strength, a reminder that she wasn't alone. He shared stories of his own battles, like the time he faced down bounty hunters after leaving the Harrove gang. People judge what they don't understand, he told her. Keep doing what's right, and the truth will outlast their lies. This resilience was key, but it came with a cost. Thornton and Langston's actions weren't just words, they were a warning of worse to come. Thornton's desperation, fueled by debt and pride, made him unpredictable. Langston, with his calculating gaze, saw Elizabeth not just as an obstacle, but as a challenge, a woman whose spirit he wanted to break. Their schemes were tightening like a noose, and Elizabeth and Caleb were at its center. Let's talk about the mistake Thornton and Langston were making. They assumed they could manipulate Silver Creek's fears, turning the town against two outsiders. It's a common error, even today, underestimating a community's heart, believing money and power can override trust. Elizabeth and Caleb weren't just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for the right to be seen for who they were, not what others assumed. Their bond, forged in shared defiance, was a strength Thornton and Langston couldn't predict. Elizabeth's work continued each patient. She helped a small victory against the rumors. But victories don't end battles, and a greater test loomed. Thornton and Langston were planning a public move, a dinner at the town's hotel, where they'd rally Silver Creek's leaders to their cause. Elizabeth and Caleb would need to face them head on, risking their reputations to expose the truth. Could they outsmart men driven by greed and ego? Or would Silver Creek's prejudices prove too strong? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Elizabeth faces her greatest challenge, yet a life-or-death medical emergency that will test her skills and force her to confront the town's doubts. Will her courage be enough to save a life and her place in Silver Creek stay with us as the stakes rise and Elizabeth's journey takes a dramatic turn? 6. The greatest challenge, a life-saving surgery. There are moments in life when everything you've learned, every ounce of courage you've gathered, is put to the test. For Elizabeth Harper, that moment came in the late summer of 1878 in Silver Creek, Montana. She'd found a new purpose as Dr. Samuel Grayson's medical assistant, healing the town's ailments despite whispers of doubt. Her unlikely ally, Caleb Stone, a rancher with a past as complex as her own, saw her worth when others didn't. But as James Thornton and Victor Langston schemed to undermine them both, Elizabeth faced a challenge that would define her place in Silver Creek, not just as a woman, but as a healer. The crisis began with Tommy Walsh, a 9-year-old boy from a nearby ranch. Tommy was the youngest of the Walsh family, known for his boundless energy and knack for climbing where he shouldn't. One afternoon, he fell from a loft in the family barn, striking his head and breaking his arm. His parents, frantic, brought him to Dr. Grayson's office, where Elizabeth was working alone. The boy was unconscious, his face pale blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. Elizabeth recognized the signs immediately: a head injury with possible pressure building inside his skull, a condition that could be fatal without intervention. She knew what needed to be done, a procedure called trepanation, drilling a small hole in the skull to relieve the pressure, but she'd never performed it before. She'd only read about it in Dr. Grayson's medical texts. Caleb Stone arrived soon after having heard the news in town. He offered to help, his calm presence a steady anchor in the storm of Elizabeth's doubt. Together they prepared for the procedure, Elizabeth drawing on every lesson she'd absorbed from Grayson's books and her own observations. She cleaned the wound, set the broken arm, and began the delicate task of trepanation, guided by Caleb's steady hands and her own resolve. The procedure was a success. The pressure was relieved. Tommy's breathing stabilized, and he showed signs of recovery by dawn. Elizabeth's skill had saved his life, but the town's reaction was mixed. Some saw her as a hero, others as reckless a woman daring to play doctor. Let's pause to understand the weight of this moment. In 1878, frontier medicine was a world of improvisation where doctors worked with crude tools and limited knowledge. Trepanation, though ancient, used by Greeks and even prehistoric cultures, was rare and risky even for trained physicians. Medical journals from the time, like those in American Medical Weekly, document cases like that of a Kansas farmer in 1875 whose skull was drilled by a local doctor to treat a head injury with mixed results. For Elizabeth, a woman with no formal degree, to attempt such a procedure was extraordinary. It wasn't just about skill, it was about courage, the courage to act when a life hung in the balance, despite the doubts of others and her own fears. Elizabeth's success with Tommy Walsh was a turning point, but it deepened the divide in Silver Creek. Those she'd helped, like the Walshes, praised her spreading word of her skill, but others, stirred by Thornton's rumors and Langston's influence, saw her actions as proof of her dangerous ambition. They argued that a woman shouldn't wield such power, that her lack of a diploma made her a liability. This wasn't new. Women in medicine, like Elizabeth Blackwell or Clara Barton, faced similar accusations, their competence questioned not for results but for their gender. Elizabeth, though, wasn't swayed. She kept working her late-night studies fueled by a determination to prove her worth, not just for herself, but for every patient who trusted her. Caleb's role in the procedure was just as significant. He didn't question Elizabeth's ability, didn't hesitate to follow her lead. His respect for her skill, honed by his own unconventional learning with a Cheyenne healer, strengthened their bond. They spoke afterward, sharing a quiet moment of relief and reflection. Caleb admitted he'd seen too many lives lost to hesitation, a lesson from his outlaw days. Elizabeth, in turn, confessed her fear of failing Tommy, of proving the town's doubts right. Their honesty deepened their connection of partnership rooted in mutual trust and a shared defiance of Silver Creek's judgments. But this victory came with a cost. Thornton and Langston seized on the trepidation, twisting it into a scandal. They pressured the local newspaper to publish more articles, questioning whether Dr. Grayson's stroke had clouded his judgment in letting Elizabeth practice. Langston, with his Chicago wealth, hinted at funding a proper doctor, one who'd serve their interests. Thornton, driven by his bruised ego and mounting debts, saw Elizabeth's success as a personal affront, and Caleb's refusal to sell his land as a direct challenge. Their schemes were no longer just whispers, they were a public campaign to drive Elizabeth and Caleb out. Let's talk about the mistake Silver Creek was making here. The town swayed by Thornton, and Langston judged Elizabeth's actions by fear, not facts, assuming her gender and lack of credentials outweighed her results. It's a trap we still fall into, dismissing someone's potential because they don't fit our expectations. Elizabeth and Caleb were proving that true value lies in what you do not, what others say you can't. Their courage in the face of doubt was a lesson for us all. When you believe in your purpose, no rumor can dim your light. Elizabeth's work with Tommy Walsh had changed Silver Creek, but the battle was far from over. Thornton and Langston were planning their boldest move, yet a town council meeting where they demand Elizabeth's removal and pressure Caleb to sell. This wasn't just about one woman or one ranch. It was about the soul of Silver Creek, a fight for who could belong and who could lead. Could Elizabeth face down her critics and prove her worth once and for all? Or would the town's fears hand victory to those who sought control? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Elizabeth steps into the heart of Silver Creek's conflict, facing Thornton and Langston in a public showdown that will test her resolve. Will the town rally behind her, or will prejudice prevail? Stay with us as Elizabeth's journey reaches a critical turning point, revealing the true power of a community's heart. 7. Showdown at the Town Council. There are times when a single moment can define not just your life, but the heart of a community. In the late summer of 1878, Silver Creek, Montana, reached such a moment. Elizabeth Harper, once a stranger in this dusty frontier town, had become a lifeline for many healing wounds and saving lives as Dr. Samuel Grayson's medical assistant. Her courage, especially in saving young Tommy Walsh through a daring surgery, had won her allies but also enemies. James Thornton, the rancher, whose promises had lured her west, and Victor Langston, a Chicago investor with eyes on Caleb Stone's land, were determined to drive her out. Their battleground, a town council meeting that would test Elizabeth's resolve and reveal Silver Creek's true character. The meeting was called to address concerns about Elizabeth's role in medicine, fueled by Thornton and Langston's campaign. They'd used the Silver Creek Weekly Gazette to sow doubt, painting her as an untrained woman, endangering lives under a stroke-weakened doctor. Langston, with his wealth and polished words, pushed for a new physician, one he'd fund, one who'd serve their interests. Thornton, driven by debt and a bruised ego, saw Elizabeth's success as a personal insult, her alliance with Caleb Stone a challenge to his power. The council, made up of the mayor, sheriff, bank manager, and preacher, faced a choice: support Elizabeth or bow to the pressure of money and influence. Elizabeth prepared for the meeting with a quiet determination. She'd faced skepticism before in Boston, where her teaching was deemed too bold, and in Silver Creek, where her intellect made her an outsider. But this was different. This wasn't just about her. It was about the patients who trusted her, the girls like Tommy Walsh's sister who saw her as proof that women could be more. Caleb Ever, her steady ally, offered support, revealing he'd quietly filed papers with the Territorial Medical Board to register her as Dr. Grayson's apprentice, a legal shield she hadn't known she had. Dr. Grayson, despite his lingering weakness, insisted on attending his presence, a silent testament to her skill. The meeting drew a crowd with townsfolk packing the hall, their voices a mix of support and suspicion. Langston spoke first, his tone smooth but condescending. He praised Silver Creek's potential, but warned of the dangers of untrained practitioners, comparing Elizabeth's work to a builder constructing a house without plans. He offered to fund a university-trained doctor from Chicago, a generous gesture that swayed some. Then he turned to Elizabeth, suggesting she could study medicine properly under his sponsorship in Chicago. The offer was a trap designed to remove her from Silver Creek and place her under his control. Elizabeth responded with a clarity that cut through the room's tension. She acknowledged the value of credentials, but argued that results mattered more on the frontier where trained doctors were scarce. She spoke of Tommy Walsh, whose life she'd saved, and Mary Davis, who'd survived a difficult childbirth because of her care. She admitted her limitations working only under Dr. Grayson's guidance, but challenged Langston's motives. Why, she asked, was a Chicago investor so concerned with Silver Creek's health? Could it be tied to his desire for Caleb's water-rich land, or Thornton's vendetta against her? Her words struck a nerve, exposing the greed behind Langston's generosity. The townsfolk spoke next, and their voices shifted the tide. Tommy Walsh. His arm still in a cast, declared Elizabeth had saved him, his simple words carrying more weight than Langston's promises. Mary Davis recounted her survival, crediting Elizabeth's knowledge. Even Lucy, a saloon worker Elizabeth had treated with kindness, spoke up her testimony, a quiet act of courage. Dr. Grayson sealed the case, praising Elizabeth's aptitude and affirming her legal apprenticeship. He challenged Langston's offer, noting that any doctor who served only a benefactor's interests wasn't truly serving the town. The council's decision was a victory for Elizabeth. They allowed her to continue under Dr. Grayson's supervision, with a plan for her to pursue formal certification through correspondence. Langston's offer was declined, his influence checked. Thornton, furious, stormed out, vowing the fight wasn't over. But the room buzzed with a new energy. Silver Creek had chosen trust over fear, community over control. Let's pause to understand what this meant. In 1878, frontier towns like Silver Creek were battlegrounds for change, where old norms clashed with new possibilities. Women's voices were rarely heard in public forums, yet Elizabeth's stand echoed early advocacy efforts like the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where women demanded a say in their futures. Historical accounts like those of Wyoming's 1869 suffrage law show how frontier communities sometimes led the way in recognizing women's rights driven by practical needs. Elizabeth's victory wasn't just personal. It was a crack in the wall of prejudice, a sign that Silver Creek could evolve. The town's mistake had been letting fear and gossip cloud their judgment, a trap Thornton and Langston exploited. It's a lesson we still grapple with, judging others by rumors rather than actions. Elizabeth and her supporters proved that truth and results can outshine manipulation, but only when a community dares to listen. Her work had won hearts not through charm, but through competence and care. This victory, though, was only a battle, not the war. Thornton and Langston, humiliated, wouldn't retreat quietly. Their desperation, Thornton's debts, Langston's ambition, made them dangerous. Elizabeth and Caleb, now more united than ever, faced a new threat, a direct attack on Caleb's land, one that would push them to their limits. Could they protect what they'd built, or would Silver Creek's darker forces prevail? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Elizabeth and Caleb confront Thornton and Langston's boldest scheme, yet a dangerous move that threatens everything they hold dear. Will their courage hold, or will greed tear Silver Creek apart? Stay with us as Elizabeth's journey takes a perilous turn, testing the bonds of trust and bravery. 8 Danger Lurks, the break-in at Caleb's ranch. Sometimes the battles you fight aren't just for yourself, but for everything you've built and everyone who believes in you. In the late summer of 1878, Elizabeth Harper and Caleb Stone stood at such a crossroads in Silver Creek, Montana. Elizabeth had proven her worth saving lives as Dr. Samuel Grayson's medical assistant and winning the town council's support against James Thornton and Victor Langston's schemes. Caleb, her steadfast ally, held firm against pressures to sell his water-rich ranch. But Thornton and Langston humiliated, and desperate weren't done. Their next move would push Elizabeth and Caleb into a confrontation that tested their courage and their bond, revealing the true cost of standing up to greed. Thornton's world was unraveling. His ranch, once the pride of Silver Creek, was sinking under debts from lost cattle and bad investments. His pride, wounded by Elizabeth's rejection, burned hotter with her growing influence. Langston, the Chicago investor, was losing patience. He'd come to Silver Creek to control the cattle trade, and Caleb's land with its springs and creek was the key. When legal pressure and public attacks failed, Thornton and Langston turned to darker means. They hired 3 rough men from a nearby mining camp, planning to break into Caleb's ranch and steal the deed to his land. Without proof of ownership, Caleb could lose everything, and Thornton would claim the water rights he'd coveted for years. Elizabeth learned of the plan through whispers in town. Lucy, a saloon worker she'd treated with kindness, overheard Thornton boasting to Langston about taking care of Stone. Elizabeth knew she had to warn Caleb, even if it meant risking her reputation. Further gossip about their friendship was already rife. She rode to his ranch, her heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Caleb listened, his face grim but resolute. He'd faced danger before as an outlaw with the hair of gang, but this was different. This was his home, his fresh start, and Elizabeth was now part of it. Together, they decided to confront the intruders, hoping to catch them in the act and expose Thornton's desperation. Their plan was risky. Caleb's ranch was isolated miles from town, and help was hours away. Elizabeth insisted on staying, arguing that if violence erupted, her medical skills might be needed. Caleb, though reluctant, agreed, recognizing her determination. They prepared to face Thornton Langston and their hired men, knowing the outcome could change their lives and Silver Creek forever. When the intruders arrived searching for the deed hidden in Caleb's cabin, Elizabeth and Caleb confronted them, demanding they leave. Thornton, caught red-handed, tried to bluff, claiming he was there for business. Langston, cooler but no less ruthless, suggested the deed's loss would be a misfortune. Caleb couldn't fight. Elizabeth's presence shifted the balance. Her voice, steady despite the danger, declared that she testified to their crime, her credibility bolstered by the town council's recent support. The hired men hesitated, unwilling to risk a witness of her standing. Langston, seeing the plan unravel, distanced himself, refusing to endorse theft outright. Thornton, abandoned by his ally, relented, leaving the deed behind, but vowing revenge. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, but the threat lingered. Thornton's desperation and Langston's ambition wouldn't fade easily. Let's pause to understand the stakes here. In 1878, land disputes in the American West were often settled with violence, not law. Water rights like those on Caleb's ranch were critical in a region where drought could ruin fortunes. Historical accounts like those of the Musselshell Valley disputes in Montana during the 1880s show how ranchers and miners clashed over land titles, sometimes resorting to theft or intimidation to seize deeds. Thornton and Langston's break-in was a classic tactic, exploiting the frontier's weak legal systems. Elizabeth's role as a witness was pivotal. Her status, earned through her medical work, gave her a voice that even hired thugs couldn't ignore. This moment wasn't just about a deed. It was about power. Thornton and Langston wanted to control Silver Creek's future, dictating who could thrive and who couldn't. Elizabeth and Caleb, as outsiders, challenged that control, proving that courage and truth could stand against greed. Their partnership, forged in shared defiance, was a beacon for the town, showing that unity could overcome division. But it also made them targets. Their victory, a spark that could ignite further conflict. Let's talk about the mistake Thornton and Langston made. They underestimated Elizabeth and Caleb, assuming a woman and a former outlaw could be broken by fear. It's a lesson we see time and again, judging others by their surface, not their strength. Elizabeth's resolve, backed by her growing trust in Caleb, showed that the greatest power lies in standing firm for what's right, even when the odds are against you. The break-in had exposed Thornton and Langston's desperation, but it also deepened Elizabeth and Caleb's bond. Their shared stand against danger brought them closer, raising questions about their future, not just as allies, but as something more. Silver Creek, though, was still a town divided, and Thornton's threats hinted at darker plans. Could Elizabeth and Caleb build on their victory, or would their defiance push their enemies to new extremes? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Elizabeth and Caleb face the personal cost of their courage as their bond grows amid rising tensions. Will their connection offer hope, or will it draw them into Silver Creek's deepest conflicts? Stay with us as Elizabeth's journey takes an emotional turn, revealing the heart of what it means to belong. 9. Love and Commitment, Elizabeth and Caleb. In the quiet moments after a storm, you often find clarity, not just about where you stand, but about who stands with you. In the late summer of 1878, Elizabeth Harper and Caleb Stone found themselves in such a moment in Silver Creek, Montana. They'd faced down James Thornton and Victor Langston's desperate attempt to steal Caleb's land deed, proving their strength as allies. Elizabeth, a medical assistant whose intellect had won the town's trust, and Caleb, a rancher with a shadowed past, had become more than partners in survival. Their bond, forged through shared trials, was blossoming into something deeper, a love that challenged everything they'd been taught to expect. The confrontation at Caleb's ranch had changed them. Standing together against Thornton's hired men, Elizabeth had found a courage she hadn't known. She possessed her voice steady as she declared her intent to testify. Caleb, who'd once lived by the gun as an outlaw, chose restraint, trusting Elizabeth's presence to shift the tide. In the aftermath, as they restored order to his ransacked cabin, they shared a quiet understanding. Their conversations, once centered on books and medicine, turned to their hopes and fears. Elizabeth admitted her struggle to trust after Thornton's betrayal, her fear that love might demand she dim her ambitions. Caleb, in turn, spoke of his past leaving the Harrow gang, not just to survive, but to live with purpose, a purpose he now saw in protecting his land and standing by Elizabeth. Their connection wasn't just emotional. It was intellectual, rooted in a mutual respect that set them apart in Silver Creek. Caleb valued Elizabeth's mind, her knowledge of anatomy, her hunger for learning, without seeing it as a threat. Elizabeth admired Caleb's self-taught wisdom, from Xi'an healing practices to his experiments with drought-resistant cattle. They challenged each other, their talks ranging from Marcus Aurelius to the future of the West. In a town where men led and women followed, their equality was revolutionary, a partnership that defied the norms of 1878. Let's pause to understand what this meant. In the American West, relationships were often practical, shaped by survival. Women married for security, men for labor or legacy. But some couples broke that mold, building lives on shared dreams. Historical accounts like that of Abigail Scott Duniway, an Oregon suffragist who partnered with her husband Ben in the 1850s to advocate for women's rights, show how mutual respect could redefine marriage. Like Abigail and Ben, Elizabeth and Caleb saw each other as equals. Their love, a foundation for growth, not constraint. This wasn't just romance. It was a rebellion against a world that demanded conformity. As their feelings grew, Elizabeth faced a choice. In Boston, she'd resigned herself to spinsterhood, believing no man would value a woman whose intellect rivaled his own. Thornton's rejection had reinforced that fear, his letters promising respect, but delivering control. Caleb was different. He didn't ask her to change, didn't see her medical work as a barrier to love. Instead, he offered a future where she could be both a healer and a partner, her ambitions celebrated, not tolerated. Caleb, too, wrestled with his past, wondering if a former outlaw deserved a woman like Elizabeth. But her trust in him, her refusal to judge him by his history, gave him hope. Their commitment came quietly, not with grand gestures, but with honest words. Caleb spoke of a life together, not as a savior or master, but as a partner who'd stand by her side. Elizabeth, her heart open despite her fears, accepted seeing in Caleb the rare soul who valued her for her mind, not despite it. Their promise wasn't just to each other. It was to Silver Creek to build a life that showed what was possible when love and respect went hand in hand. They agreed to marry, a decision that felt as natural as the Montana sunrise, yet carried the weight of a new beginning. But love, even the truest kind, doesn't shield you from danger. Thornton and Langston, though thwarted, hadn't given up. Thornton's debts grew heavier, his pride a festering wound. Langston, with his cold ambition, saw Elizabeth's influence and her bond with Caleb as obstacles to his plans. The town, though supportive of Elizabeth after the council meeting, remained divided, with some still swayed by whispers of scandal. Elizabeth and Caleb's engagement would only fuel those tensions, drawing them deeper into Silver Creek's conflicts. Let's talk about the mistake Silver Creek was making here. The town, caught in old ways, saw Elizabeth and Caleb's relationship as improper, judging them by outdated rules rather than their actions. It's a trap we all risk, clinging to tradition when change offers something better. Elizabeth and Caleb's love showed that true partnership lifts both, a lesson Silver Creek needed to learn. Their commitment wasn't just personal. It was a challenge to a community to rethink what love and life could be. This moment of clarity brought Elizabeth and Caleb closer, but it also set the stage for their greatest trial. Thornton and Langston, pushed to their limits, were plotting a final move, one that would threaten not just Caleb's land, but the future Elizabeth and Caleb dreamed of. Could their love withstand the forces arrayed against them, or would Silver Creek's divisions tear them apart? Let's find out in our next chapter, where Elizabeth and Caleb face the legacy of their choices as Silver Creek grapples with its own future. Will their vision inspire the town, or will greed and fear prevail? Stay with us as Elizabeth's journey reaches its heartfelt conclusion, revealing the enduring power of love and courage. 10 Legacy and the Future of Silver Creek. Every journey leaves a mark, not just on those who travel it, but on the places they touch along the way. In the late summer of 1878, Elizabeth Harper and Caleb Stone had transformed Silver Creek, Montana, not with grand gestures, but with quiet courage and unyielding belief in what was possible. They'd faced rejection, danger, and doubt, Elizabeth as a woman whose intellect defied norms, Caleb as a man whose past cast a long shadow. Together, they'd stood against James Thornton and Victor Langston's greed, saving Caleb's land and securing Elizabeth's place as a healer. Their love, rooted in respect, had blossomed into a commitment to each other and to Silver Creek. Now, as the dust settled, their legacy began to take shape, a beacon for a town ready to grow. Elizabeth's victory at the town council had been more than a personal triumph. It was a turning point for Silver Creek, a moment when the community chose trust over fear, valuing results over prejudice. She continued her work with Dr. Samuel Grayson, treating patients with a skill that silenced her critics. Over time, she pursued formal medical certification through correspondence with the Women's Medical College in Chicago, a grueling process of late-night study and exams sent by mail. 5 years later, she became Silver Creek's first fully qualified female physician, her practice serving not just the town, but 3 counties around it. Women especially sought her out, finding in her a healer who understood their struggles and a role model who showed what they could become. Caleb, too, left his mark. His ranch thrived, its water source, sustaining a community of smaller farmers who settled nearby. But his impact went beyond land. Drawing on his self-taught knowledge of law, Caleb worked to draft legislation protecting married women's property rights in the Montana Territory, ensuring no woman would lose her home to a husband's debts. His quiet advocacy, inspired by Elizabeth's strength, helped shape a fairer future for Silver Creek's families. Together, they became a cornerstone of the town, their partnership a living proof that love and equality could build something lasting. Silver Creek itself changed. Thornton's ranch, crippled by debt, was sold off in parcels to new settlers, creating a more diverse community than his cattle empire ever could. Langston returned to Chicago, his ambitions thwarted, though rumors of his predatory patterns persisted. The town grew with a new school and a small hospital, both shaped by Elizabeth's vision. Young women inspired by her example began to dream bigger. Some studied medicine, others taught, and a few, like Tommy Walsh's sister, dared to imagine lives beyond traditional roles. Elizabeth welcomed them, sharing her story as a reminder that knowledge was the beginning of freedom. Let's pause to understand what this legacy meant. In 1878, frontier towns like Silver Creek were crucibles of change where necessity often outpaced tradition. Women's contributions, though often unsung, were vital teachers. Midwives and homesteaders shaped the West as much as ranchers or miners. Historical accounts like those of Virginia City, Montana, where women like Sarah Bickford became business owners in the 1880s, show how their work laid the foundation for progress. Elizabeth's journey echoed these stories, proving that one person's courage could ripple outward, changing not just a town, but the possibilities for those who followed. Silver Creek's mistake had been judging Elizabeth and Caleb by their differences, her intellect, his past, rather than their actions. It's a lesson we carry today. We too often dismiss those who don't fit our molds, missing the gifts they bring. Elizabeth and Caleb's legacy was a call to see people for who they are, to value their contributions over conformity. Their story wasn't just about a woman finding her place or a man redeeming his past. It was about a community learning to grow by embracing its outsiders. As Elizabeth and Caleb built their life together, they never forgot the trials that shaped them. Elizabeth's office became a haven, not just for healing bodies, but for nurturing dreams. She told young women the truth she'd learned. Education is never excessive. It's the key to charting your own course, to finding those rare souls who value you for your mind. Caleb, by her side, lived that truth. His quiet strength a testament to second chances. Their home, filled with books and laughter, was a symbol of what Silver Creek could be, a place where everyone had a chance to belong. This wasn't the end of challenges for Silver Creek, but it was a new beginning. Elizabeth and Caleb's legacy lived on in the girls who studied, the families who thrived, and the town that learned to see beyond its fears. Their story reminds us that the greatest legacies aren't built with power or wealth, but with courage, love, and the belief that one person can make a difference. What mark will you leave on your own community? What dreams will you dare to chase, knowing that the path may be hard, but the impact eternal? As we close Elizabeth's journey, let's carry her lesson forward. Like Silver Creek, our world is shaped by those who dare to be different, who choose love over fear, and who build bridges where walls once stood. Thank you for joining us in this story of heart and hope. If Elizabeth and Caleb's tale touched you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and keep dreaming big, because like Elizabeth learned, fortune favors the brave. As we bid farewell to Elizabeth Harper and Caleb Stone's transformative journey in Silver Creek, their story leaves us with a timeless truth. Courage and love can reshape not just lives, but entire communities. Their legacy reminds us to embrace our own potential, to stand firm in our worth, and to build bridges where others see walls. What mark will you leave on your world? Let Elizabeth's bravery inspire you to chase your dreams no matter the odds. If this tale touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a spark of hope. And if you're ready for more stories of resilience and triumph, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell to join our channel's journey. Stay connected, stay inspired, and let's keep exploring the power of the human spirit together. Thank you for watching.